Sunday morning, August 15th, 1971, Palo Alto, California. Coffee, newspapers, and the quiet typical of a neighborhood where nothing important is expected to happen. Then, a police car turns onto a residential street. Then another. Officers knock on doors. Young men are led outside, read their rights, and handcuffed in front of their neighbors. They are pushed into the back of squad cars, confused and compliant. They had done nothing wrong. These men had simply answered a newspaper advertisement for a psychological study. This arrest was the opening move of an experiment designed to see just how quickly an ordinary person could become a monster. At Stanford University, psychology professor Philip Zimbardo was obsessed with a single question. Does human behavior come from nature, or is it a product of the situation? He recruited 24 college students. They were screened for psychological health, ensuring there were no histories of crime or hidden aggression. These were, by every metric, normal young men. Then, a coin flip decided their lives for the next 2 weeks. 12 became guards. 12 became prisoners. They were the same people with the same backgrounds, but now one group held the batons and the other wore the numbers. Zimbardo was setting out to prove that these assigned institutional roles and the situations they created might be powerful enough to override a person's entire moral compass. The transition was immediate. Prisoners were stripped, deloused, and given smocks with numbers. Chains were placed around their ankles to ensure they never forgot they were no longer students, but subjects. The guards were issued mirrored sunglasses. It was a deliberate choice to block eye contact. When you cannot look someone in the eyes, it becomes much easier to stop seeing them as a person. Within hours, the guards began to experiment with their power. At 2:30 a.m., they blasted whistles for the first of many prisoner counts, interrupting sleep not for security, but to exercise control. By day 2, the prisoners rebelled, barricading their cells. The guards responded by spraying them with fire extinguishers and creating a privilege cell for those who didn't participate, successfully turning the prisoners against one another. The guards had discovered that violence wasn't necessary to break a person. Controlling their basic needs and destroying their trust in each other was far more effective. As the experiment progressed, the guards began to exhibit genuine sadism. They forced prisoners to use plastic buckets as toilets and then refused to let them empty the waste, turning the cells into a biohazard. The psychological weight became unbearable. After only 36 hours, prisoner 8612 suffered a total collapse. This was a healthy, screamed young man, yet he was now pacing his cell, crying uncontrollably, and screaming to be released from the basement. Zimbardo's reaction was the first sign that the experiment had gone too far. Instead of ending the study, he suspected the prisoner was faking his distress to get out of the simulation. He was wrong. The trauma was so pervasive that 3 out of the 12 prisoners broke down and were released before the study was even halfway through. The trap had captured the researcher himself. Zimbardo was no longer looking at the data. He was managing his inmates. He had become the warden. The most disturbing footage didn't come from the daytime. It happened during the night shift, when the guards believed the researchers were away and the cameras were no longer recording. The abuse became more degrading, more creative, and more frequent. The guards weren't acting out of hatred or following a specific ideology. They were simply bored. It showed that when ordinary people are given absolute authority without oversight, boredom alone is enough to produce barbarism. On day 5, Christina Maslach, a psychologist and Zimbardo's girlfriend, arrived to interview the participants. She watched as prisoners were marched on a toilet run with bags over their heads and their legs chained together. Over 50 other observers had seen the same thing and said nothing because they accepted the authority of the experiment. Maslach was the only one to object. She confronted Zimbardo, telling him directly that what he was doing to those boys was wrong. The systemic abuse only halted when an outsider, someone who hadn't been conditioned by the environment of the basement, refused to accept the reality Zimbardo had built. The experiment was shut down the next day. Zimbardo would spend the rest of his career haunted by how quickly he had traded his role as a scientist for that of a cruel administrator. Decades later, the Stanford basement found a mirror in the real world. In 2004, photographs emerged of U.S. military personnel committing strikingly similar abuses at Abu Ghraib in Iraq. Those soldiers weren't outliers or born monsters. They were people placed into the exact same situational psychology that Zimbardo had manufactured in 1971. This dynamic exists anywhere authority is granted without accountability, in modern workplaces, in complex hierarchies, and behind uniforms. The situation takes over, and the person inside the role begins to disappear. If you were handed the mirrored sunglasses and the baton, would you have been the one to exercise that power, or would you have been the one to say no?